Hi everybody, welcome to Social Psychology. It makes sense that we'll start off by talking about what is social psychology. So let's start right there. Let's start with the good basic definition. Social psychology is a scientific study of how people think, feel, and behave in a social context. Remember, psychology is simply the scientific study of how people think, feel, and behave. So we're adding that social context to it. I like to think of it in another way, a simpler way. It's the scientific study of the person in the situation, the social situation. So we'll come back to that definition as we go along this semester. There are three key components to the definition that I mentioned above. Let's parse that out and talk about each part. So first of all, social psychology is scientific. It's a scientific study. It focuses on how people think, feel, and behave. We'll talk a little bit about that real quickly. And it's somewhat limited, I'm doing little air quotes there, in social situations. We'll talk about that in a second as well. So let's talk about that first key component. Social psychology uses scientific methods to study social situations. And that's really an important point. So let's talk about what scientific methods involve. All scientific methods involve systematic observation. That means looking at things. And when we look at things, we measure things. And then when we measure things, we describe those things that we see. That's what science is all about. We can study anything scientifically as long as we are systematically observing things, taking measurements, and then describing what we see. Let me give you a great example from social psychology. You probably learned in Intro Psych about Stanley Milgram and his research on obedience to authority. Let's just look at what Milgram did just a little bit, and you'll get a sense of what I mean about how social psychology uses scientific methods. This is Milgram right here, and he's standing by the shock generator that they used in his research studies. And essentially, Milgram had this idea that in his own lab, he can create a situation that might help explain why it seems that some people follow authority figures to the extent that they might even harm someone, like happened in World War II. You might recall that there were concentration camps and millions of people were murdered because they were Jews and because the authority figures at the time, so we're talking about military personnel, ordered others to carry out those horrific acts. How can we explain something like that happening? Well, Milgram was trying to recreate that in the lab. Milgram was trying to recreate a situation in which people were taking orders from an authority figure. So here's what he did. He paid people $4. Now, this was back in the 1960s, the early 1960s. So $4 was, a decent chunk of change for an hour's worth of research. He wanted people to study what he was saying was a study of memory. So they were going to be research participants. And when they came into the lab, they would notice this type of situation where there would be an experimenter. He was the authority figure. He was in charge. There was another research subject who appeared to be a research subject, but he was really working with the experimenter. In this particular study, he was supposed to learn some word pairs. And then there was the subject in the study. And sometimes the subject would even kind of watch as they would hook this person up to some electrodes. Because this research study was about teaching, here's the teacher, the real research subject, this learner who was really working with the experimenter, some word pairs. And every time this guy got a word pair wrong, the teacher was going to shock him. So here is one of the teachers. Remember, he's the real subject. He's the only subject in this experiment. Everybody else is working for the experimenter. And you can see he is touching this shock generator. So as he's reading these word pairs, if the learner in the other room is making a mistake, he's going to shock him. And the shock generator was very realistic. That looks very realistic. In fact, it did deliver shocks. It just was not hooked up to anybody. But at the very beginning of the study, that research subject right there did get a sample shock of like 45 volts or so. And that's kind of painful. So they understood that it did work. It's just that it wasn't really hooked up. They didn't know that. So as time went on, they had to deliver more and more shocks. Remember, look at that shock generator. It goes all the way up to 450 volts. And it's labeled XXX. It's very scary looking. 450 volts could kill someone very easily. So as it got really high, most subjects would behave like this subject is in this picture. He'd look back to the experimenter and be like, are you serious? You want me to give him all this voltage in a shock? We can kill this guy in here. And that person in the other room, that learner, was sometimes screaming, saying, I want out of the experiment. Kind of like what might happen in a concentration camp when someone is screaming for their lives. And all the time, the experimenter would say, please continue. The experimenter requires that you continue. You must go on. They would kind of escalate those prods to get them to continue. And what was Milgram trying to see? How far would this guy go? How far would he go in that shock generator? Would he go all the way to 450 volts and be fully compliant? They went through a lot of anguish. No one likes to be in a situation like that. At this point, he's like, are you serious? You really want me to go on? Are you going to take responsibility if this guy gets hurt? And the experimenter would say, yes, I take responsibility. Sometimes that was all it would take for the subject to go on and deliver the next shock, just following orders. So what happened in this research study? Again, we're using systematic observation, watching what's going on, taking careful measurements. And here's one of the most basic measurements. How far did the people go? Well, you can see here about 65% of the people, if you follow the number over here, about 65% of the people who took part in Milgram's original study went all the way to 450 volts. And they saw that as being fully compliant, fully obedient. So that's a great example of a research study right there, using systematic observation, taking measurements, and describing what you see. Let's talk about that second key component to that definition of psychology. Social psychology really focuses on a huge variety of topics. And that's because, remember, that definition involved studying thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So we're talking about thoughts, beliefs, attitudes. We're talking about mental processes, feelings, emotions. We're talking about other mental processes, but now they're more emotional, obviously. And then behaviors. One way to break this down into an easy way to remember things is to just think about the ABCs of social psychology. And I find this very helpful. All psychological things that we study have A's, B's, and C's. A always stands for affect. Affective things are emotional things, feelings and emotions. B would be behavioral things. That's pretty obvious. People's actions. And then there's always a cognitive component of psychology as well. There we're talking about mental processes like thoughts, beliefs, and attitudes. So another thing to keep in mind about all these topics that we study in psychology, and social psychology in particular, is that anything that we're studying in psychology has the individual person as the unit of analysis. And what I mean by that is even when we might be studying groups, like this group right here that's studying, I'm interested in the individual in that group. So for example, I'm interested in this girl right here. I want to know what she's thinking, feeling. I want to know how she's behaving. Now, of course, she's affected by the other people in the group. She's probably going to strategize about how to act in this group so that she kind of looks most favorable in their eyes. She might be worried about how they perceive her. They're probably worried about how she perceives them. There's all kinds of interesting dynamics going on. The third component of that definition that we talked about is that social psych is limited to social situations. And the reason why I kind of find that word a little bit funny and I put it in quotes is because social situations are all around us. It's very hard to find a situation that isn't socially related. So let me give you a couple examples because, as I mentioned right here, all situations have social components, even when people are alone. So when is it that social psych is relevant? Well, there are a couple ways to think about it. Social psych is relevant when people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, remember those A's, B's, and C's, focus on other people. So in this situation, if I'm focusing on her and I'm really looking at her as a unit of analysis, she's the person I'm really trying to learn about. I need to figure out, are her thoughts, feelings, and behaviors focused on other people? Yes, she's working with these people. She's trying to work cooperatively. Again, as I mentioned, she's probably interested in presenting herself in a particular way. They're probably worried about how they're presenting themselves. They're working cooperatively and trying to learn from one another, but maybe they're also somewhat competing with each other as well, as often happens in academic situations. So is there a component of other people being the focus of attention? Of course. So clearly that type of situation is relevant to a social psychological analysis. Are these people being influenced by other people? That's another way to see if this is social psychologically relevant. Of course, I already mentioned several ways in which these people are influenced by one another. Now, I mentioned this point that social situations have a social component even when people are alone, and that's really fascinating. Look at this situation. It says others don't need to be present to affect our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Look at this poor guy. He's obviously upset about something. I will guarantee you, I don't know what's going on in that situation or what the actor is trying to portray, but I guarantee you there's some person involved in some way, and that makes that situation relevant to social psychology. This guy, let's say maybe got fired from his job, and he's thinking about, like, what's my family going to think? Like I'm the provider for the family. He's thinking about himself now. That was such an important part of who he was, and now he's not able to see that. Maybe he just broke up in some relationship. Obviously, he's thinking about other people. It's pretty rare that there's some type of human situation that's completely devoid of a social component. So practically any situation is relevant to a social psychologist to better understand. So just to give you a better idea, too, of some of the questions and applications for social psychology, there's this great slide, and there's a page in your textbook. Take a look at it. It's very interesting. Let me point out just a couple of things. A couple really interesting questions that social psychologists study, just to get you excited about what's coming up. Where do stereotypes come from, and why are they so resistant to change? Man, that is a critical thing for social psychologists. They study things like stereotyping and prejudice. And you'll see that it's really hard to change how people think about other people, particularly when they have biases about those people. And that's what prejudicial attitudes are. They're based on a bias toward a particular group of people. Let's look at another one of these questions. Again, very interesting to some of the things that social psychologists study. Why do people often perform worse in groups than they would have when they were alone? We're very influenced by the people around us. And sometimes when other people are around us, we might not work as hard because we don't feel the same responsibility to get the job done. We might be socially loafing. Well, these types of questions can be categorized in a variety of ways. The question about stereotypes will be a question of social perception, how we perceive other people. There are a variety of chapters in your textbook about social perception. This question right here about working with other people and how we're influenced by those people, that's an issue of social influence, and there are several chapters related to social influence. Let's look at a couple other key areas. Again, interesting questions and applications of social psychology. Here's an interesting one. How similar or different are the sexes in what they look for in an intimate relationship? I tell you, it is fascinating when I ask a class and I just say, like, guys, what are you looking for in a woman? And then when you ask the class, you say, ladies, what are you looking for in a man? Very different responses come up. Fascinating research. Here's another interesting question down here. Can interrogators really get people to confess to serious crimes they did not commit? Something like even murder. And the answer is yes. Social psychology and law is a fascinating topic in social psychology. And we really have a good understanding of why someone might confess to a crime they did not commit. All of these really fascinating topics that social psychologists study. So this one right here, this comes under the area of social interactions. And there are several chapters in the book about social interactions. And then this one right here about social psychology and law talks about how we apply social psychology to the real world. There are several chapters in the book about applications of social psychology. How does social psychology differ from other subfields in psychology, like clinical psychology, personality psychology? How is social psychology different from sociology? A lot of people confuse that. This is a great graphic in your textbook. You can look at it there, or just pause the video. Give some examples of how researchers in these different subfields might focus on different research topics. I'm going to talk about each one of these subfields and sociology in the next slide. So let's take a look at that. First of all, Does social psychology equal sociology? I've talked to students in the past and I've said, like, have you taken a social psychology class? And someone might say to me, like, well, I took sociology in high school. They're obviously confused. No. Social psychology and sociology are completely different fields of study. Sociology is not psychology. How do they differ? Well, remember, psychologists study individuals. We're interested in individual thoughts, feelings, and behavior. Now, of course, social psychologists are interested in those individuals in social situations. And keep in mind, too, like one thing that's very interesting about social psychologists is that they conduct a lot of lab experiments, kind of like that experiment I was telling you about with Stanley Milgram. How does that differ from sociology? Well, sociologists tend to study not individuals, but groups, societal groups and classes. I'll give you an example in a second. And they are much less likely to use the types of research methods that social psychologists use, much less likely to use lab experiments. Let me give you a quick example. It's important to keep in mind that their interests do often really overlap, so they might study the same types of topics. So like prejudice, social psychologists, sociologists, they can both study that same topic, violence, marriage, even something like obedience. This is the example I wanted to tell you about. So a sociologist might study obedience by looking at military culture. There's obviously a lot of obedience there. And we need it. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I mean, we need people to give orders and we need people to follow orders. And sociologists might study that large group, military organizations. And they might look at that whole culture that they see there of obedience and study that in a variety of ways. But it's very unlikely that they would study it in a laboratory situation. Now, social psychologists, as you've seen, they're going to study something like obedience in a lab so they can really narrow down some specific characteristics that drive human behavior, because they want to figure out the situational factors that influence obedience. What is it about this situation right here that this man is involved in that's going to lead him to be more or less obedient? And the thing that's beautiful about studying that in the lab is that we can treat everybody in the same way but manipulate a few things to see if they have an effect. So for example, Milgram did some original studies where that learner, remember the person who was working with the experimenter, who wasn't really getting shocked, was in another room. And then that person would be playing a tape, actually, where they might be yelling, ouch, or screaming, or saying, I want out of here. And everybody witnessed the same type of event, everybody who was in this situation as the teacher. But they might have manipulated the situation in which they had that learner, remember he's working for the experimenter, in the exact same room. And in order for him to get the shocks, the teacher, who is the real subject, had actually forced his hand onto a shock plate. And this is because Milgram wanted to see, would the proximity, the location of that learner have an effect on how obedient that teacher would be? If they're actually seeing the pain on this person's face, hearing the person yell, they're eye to eye in close contact, would that person be as obedient when it's much more personal? And the answer is no, they would not be as obedient. So obedience rates dropped in this type of situation. Do you see how much we learned from that little manipulation? And we can really only do that in a very clean, scientific way, clean measurements, when we look at it in the lab. Social psychologists love lab studies. That's one key thing about social psychology. All right, let's talk about social psych and how it differs from something like clinical psychology. Clinical psychologists, as you probably know, focus on treating people who have like thought and behavioral disorders. Social psychologists do not conduct therapy. They are not clinicians. They do not conduct any therapy. They have no clients per se. They really just study the ordinary ways in which people think, feel, and behave, and how they influence one another. And so it's typical interactions that people have, not necessarily anything that is disordered. So typical situation for a clinical psychologist, we'd have a clinician here in her office talking to a client. And this client is obviously upset about something, might be having marital problems, maybe depression, maybe this person is just not happy with her life. Who knows what it might be? Could be almost anything. And this clinician is trained to help her gain some insights and work through that. It's an amazing profession, but it is not social psychology. So what's a good example of what a social psychologist does? This is Phil Zimbardo. He worked for a long time. He's probably retired at this point at Stanford University. One of the most well-known social psychologists there is. At one point, he was the president of the American Psychological Association, the APA. And a typical social psychologist is working at a university, so you see him there in his office. Let me just give you an example of how his days are very different from the days of a clinician. So Zimbardo, at some point, way back in the 60s, he's very famous for this research, wanted to study prison life. And what he did in this situation was created essentially a mock prison in the basement of a building at Stanford University. And here you can see they're setting up bars in one of the rooms. It's going to be a cell. And it was very realistic. They recruited people to be in the study. They were all young college-aged men. And they would be paid to spend, I think it was supposed to be 2 weeks originally, in this mock prison at the basement of Stanford University. And they were arrested, so it was very realistic. And they were booked. You can see there is a kind of a rap sheet, essentially, an identification sheet being created for each one. They were actually stripped and deloused, which might really be done in a prison, and then put behind bars. It's very realistic. And Zimbardo acted as the prison superintendent. So you can see there's Zimbardo right there speaking with some of the inmates. That's a pretty interesting research study to work on. Now, of course, there are some ethical issues with it that we'll talk about soon, but you can see how different a social psychologist's day is compared to a clinician's day. I want to make sure you understood the differences. Let's talk about how social psych and personality psych differ and how they might, work together as well. Personality psychologists are obviously interested in personality. And what is personality? We're talking about differences in people's traits. We're talking about the characteristic way in which people respond to situation. So for example, look at this person right here. This person's clearly very outgoing. This person might be an extrovert. This person's like the life of the party. That's a personality trait. And personality psychologists study those types of things. This person's very different. She's very introverted. She's not the life of the party. She probably thinks a lot to herself and tries to avoid the spotlight. Personality psychologists, of course, are looking at differences in those characteristic ways that people respond to situations. That's what traits are. Now, social psychologists are looking at situational factors and how they affect behavior. So remember, in this particular study, Milgram was looking to see how does that person respond to this incredibly powerful situation where an authority figure is ordering him to deliver shocks to the learner. In that situation, they're not necessarily interested in people's personalities. They're interested in the power of that situation. Now, you can probably see that there's a difference in focus. Personality psychologists are interested in internal factors, people's characteristic ways of responding, their personality. Social psychologists are very interested in external factors, the power of the situation. You're going to hear me mention that phrase so much this semester because that's what social psychology is all about. Analyzing the person in the situation to figure out the power of that situation to drive behavior. Now, it's no stretch to see that these two areas of psychology, they're two subfields of psychology, can really complement each other very well. Because Milgram might say like, all right, I found something really interesting. People in this situation right here, about 65% of the time, are fully obedient. But is it possible that people who are extroverted, maybe they'll have more of a voice to say no, and maybe extroverted people will be less obedient? That's possible, I guess. But remember, it could go the other way. Maybe these extroverted people, they really want to please other people. They want to get along with other people. Remember, they're the life of the party. So maybe they don't want to make waves and they'd be even more obedient. That's obviously something we could study in the lab. And that would help us have a better understanding of what's going on in this incredibly powerful situation. So clearly, when we're talking about personality psychology and social psychology, they work really well together. And in fact, that lesson has not been lost on social psychologists. One very important way of viewing things in social psychology is via what we call the interactionist perspective. And what this little equation shows right here is that behavior, like this person's behavior, is a function of the interaction between the person's personality, and that environment, the situation that they're in. So that person's behavior is a function of the interaction between their personality and their environment, their situation. We call that the interactionist perspective. Essentially, brings together personality and social psychology. Now, another thing that I think is interesting to see is that personality and social psychology work together so well that some of the top journals even include both names. Top journal in social psychology is JPSP, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. Another very well-known journal in social psychology is Personality and Social Psych Bulletin. So again, it's got personality in there. Another top-notch journal, Personality and Social Psychology Review. So clearly, personality and social psychology, although they are different subfields, they complement each other incredibly well. Let's talk about how cognitive psychology and social psychology differ, but also work together. Cognitive psychologists are studying mental processes. So how people learn, how they think, how they remember, how they reason, these are all mental processes. Well, social psychologists study mental processes as well, but in social situations. So obviously they're going to work together. Social psychologists are going to learn a lot from the research of cognitive psychologists, and they're going to apply it to social types of situations. That's what we call social cognition, and social cognition is big in social psychology. And that is just simply social psychologists studying how people think, feel, reason in social situations. Here's a great example, some really interesting research. You can see here we have 3 different people, and they're posed in essentially exactly the same way, wearing essentially the exact same clothing. They're all carrying weapons, and what's being systematically varied here, the tone of their skin. And I might be interested in studying the mental processes that people go through in a shoot or do not shoot type of situation. And let's say we might find something that people have some type of a bias, such that when they see darker skin, they perceive more of a threat. And they might be more likely to shoot, whereas when people perceive lighter skin, they also perceive less of a threat. And they might be less likely to shoot, less likely to perceive a threat from this weapon. That's just an example of social cognition research. There we're looking at how people are reasoning to make a decision, but clearly there are some social factors involved and stereotypes and prejudice and things like that, things that social psychologists love to study. And, that's obviously a real world situation. Not too long ago, there was a situation where there was nothing illegal going on. This man was a therapist at a group home. I don't remember all the details. This young man right here has some type of disorder. Maybe it was autism. I could be wrong. And he was upset. And the therapist was trying to talk to him, and he was holding a toy. And some police came on the scene, and they were given some bad information initially. They thought there was going to be some type of dangerous situation. Well, they perceived a threat. They thought there was a gun at the situation, and they shot. And actually, this man right here was injured. There was no weapon involved. But you can see how this research right here might inform this real-world situation right there. And that is social cognition research. Fascinating stuff. Let's kind of close up here by talking about social psychology and common sense. Some of what you learn in this class, you might think just seems like common sense, and there's nothing wrong with that, really. But keep this in mind, be fair. Our common sense often leads us astray. And in fact, people are notorious for often feeling as if they knew something all along, regardless of what the final outcome is in a situation, and that's a problem. Let me walk you through that so you see what I mean about how common sense thinking is sometimes really problematic. There's an election coming up between essentially these 2 candidates, Trump and Clinton. Before the election, people don't really know exactly what's going to happen, particularly when it's relatively close. And let's say right now the polling is pretty close. But let's say eventually Trump actually wins. If I were to ask people about that, I guarantee you a lot of people would say, well, it's pretty obvious. I knew Trump was going to win. People are tired of insiders, and Hillary is obviously an insider. People wanted to fix America, and Trump has been able to fix things in the business world, so they were looking for some type of savior. It's pretty obvious that it was time for this type of thing to happen in our history. They're kind of making sense of it just via their common sense. But keep this in mind too. Let's say that there was an alternative outcome and Clinton wins. Then again, talk to some people and they say, like, yeah, it was pretty obvious. I knew that all along. I mean, come on, this is Clinton. She's been involved in politics for decades. She has a husband who is a president. She has such an infrastructure in place. It's not even a contest. She should be able to beat him handily, so easily. Well, what does Trump really know about the presidency? He's never, been in office before. It's so obvious she was going to win. It's just common sense. So my point that I'm trying to make is that things often seem very obvious to us once we know the answer. So you're going to read about a lot of research, and then you're going to eventually find out what the researchers discovered. And you might think to yourself, like, oh, that's just common sense. I knew that all along. You might not have known that all along. You probably would have made sense of those results, rationalized those results, no matter how they turned out. We call that hindsight bias. It's just kind of an interesting time to introduce that concept. Looking back, we often exaggerate how much we knew what was going to happen in the outcome. Some people call it the I knew it all along effect, but it's also called hindsight bias. Well, because of those types of biases in the way that we think, that's why social psychologists rely on scientific methods and not just common sense. That is it for this section. I hope that you are excited to study social psychology. So stay tuned because there's more social psychology coming up very soon.